Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our Hard Histories book talk with Dr. Tony Perry and Dr. Jenny Williams. My name is Kendra Grissom. I am a first-year student in the Department of History, and I broadly study the 20th century African American experience. Launched in fall of 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins, blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts. Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university story and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. In spring of 2021, we are hosting a series of book discussions that feature scholars on the histories of slavery and racism in Baltimore and Maryland. Today, we are excited to host the third such discussion. We invite our panelists now to turn their cameras on. We are honored to have with us for our conversation, Dr. Tony Perry and Dr. Jenny Williams. Dr. Perry is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia and the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. His work focuses on the relationship between slavery and the broader environment in the United States. Dr. Williams is a postdoctoral research scholar at UC Santa Cruz and the co-editor of the Transatlantic and Intra-American Slave Trade Databases. Her work focuses on the coastwise slave trade in the antebellum United States. Both Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams specialize on the history of slavery in Maryland. They have published articles on this topic in the journal Slavery and Abolition. The editor and publisher of the journal Slavery and Abolition have very generously provided Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams' articles available via open access for all readers until the end of April. We are posting links to these articles in the chat and encourage our viewers to peruse them. Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams will be in conversation with Hard Histories Project Director, Dr. Martha S. Jones. Dr. Jones is a Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, as well as Professor of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Perry, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Jones will be in conversation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. Finally, live caption is available directly through Zoom. For those who prefer to access captions online, we are posting the link in the chat. Thank you both for being here. I will turn the conversation over to Dr. Jones and see you all at the end of the discussion.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Kendra, for being with us today and helping to host this conversation. I also want to thank Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams. It's an honor to have both of you here today with us at Hard Histories at Hopkins. Now, folks know we've billed this as a book talk, but in fact, this is a conversation inspired not by books, but by your two very important articles published, as Kendra mentioned, in the journal Slavery and Abolition. And I also want to thank Slavery and Abolition editor Gad Human and the journal publisher Taylor and Francis for making the articles free to the public this month in connection with this discussion. I'll also say that I want to frame our conversation as a bookmark for folks watching today who should stay tuned for the book length projects from Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams that I know are in the works. We look forward to that, and we look forward to having you back to hear more about those projects as they progress. Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams, you both know, I think, that we launched Hard Histories at Hopkins in a sense as a response to new revelations about our university benefactor, Johns Hopkins, the man. And contrary to long-held assumptions, Mr. Hopkins had been a slaveholder. This has led us to ask new questions about his life, yes, but also it has led us to want to better understand enslavement in Maryland, especially from the perspectives of enslaved people. So we've invited you because I think both of you exemplify important work in this regard and really introduce us to important new vantage points on those lives of people in Baltimore, in Maryland. So before I dive into questions, I'll just remind folks tuning in, you can drop your questions in the Q&A box. and we'll have plenty of time for those a bit later in the program. So Dr. Perry, if I could start with you and ask you about your article, In Bondage When Cold Was King, The Frigid Terrain of Slavery in Antebellum Maryland. This is an article that brings together environmental history with the history of slavery. And I think readers might assume if you brought those two subjects together that we would be in some sense talking about the hot weather, the warm weather conditions of summer, of work in tobacco and grain fields. And you, I think, just introduce us to something new. First of all, about Maryland's climate. I learned that Maryland was significantly colder than it is today. Probably I should have known that, but you really make that clear. But you, more importantly, I think, show us how cold weather was an instrument of discipline and of punishment. And the seasons in Maryland also provided enslaved people with their own instruments of resistance. Dr. Williams, your article is Trouble the Water, the Baltimore to New Orleans coastwide slave trade, 1820 to 1860. And here I think, again, I think a surprise for some folks tuning in who might assume that the slave trade ended in 1808 when Congress banned the international trade. And you tell us a story about the domestic slave trade, one that was organized and outfitted and cruelly masterminded out of Baltimore's port. And I think we learn importantly how Baltimore directly fed the nation's most voracious slave market, that in New Orleans, where captives were sold to the lower South's cotton fields and sugar fields. The key words for me in your piece were dislocation and disappearance, right? That were the ever-present threat for enslaved people in Baltimore and in Maryland more generally. And as you make so clear, for some people that was indeed their fate. So I want to ask you both to talk to us about how you came to these topics, because they are fresh and perhaps unexpected. And I think folks are always interested in how historians come to go from a small bit of evidence to a larger project. So maybe a way to put it is to ask who influenced your study. Was it work of other scholars? Did you have an aha moment in the archives? Was there something in a source early on that spoke to you, that helped you to frame this? Was there a curiosity that was burning? I'll start with you, Dr. Perry, and just ask you how you came to what for us, I think, is an unexpected turn in the study of slavery in Maryland. And thanks again for being here.
Sure, and first I'd like to start just by expressing my appreciation to you, Dr. Jones, for the invitation to participate in today's conversation and just the set of important conversations that you all are having, as well as to express my appreciation to the SNF Agora Institute, and in addition to the Hard Histories team, the broader team. I'm really happy to be with you all today. As far as the project goes, I came to it from a couple of different directions. One was having the opportunity to take a couple classes with Ira Berlin. And I was an American Studies graduate student, took a couple classes on the history of slavery. I went into those classes under the assumption that I knew a lot about the histories of enslavement in the Americas, but specifically in the United States, and realized that I didn't know nearly as much as I thought I did. And so I went into grad school and went into those classes in particular with a different kind of project, but with a project that asked a lot of the same questions that are at the heart of what I'm pursuing right now in this book project that I'm working on. Questions around enslaved peoples, in broadly some of the discursive associations between enslaved peoples and and what was then thinking about them in relation to like animals, thinking about enslaved peoples, and this process of disciplining and almost domestication, in the ways in which there were parallels in some of that, in the kind of subjugation they experienced, and taming the land, right, and domesticating the land. So thinking about some of the valences between people, Black people in general, and different parts of the environment. And then I realized from these classes in particular that I could really ask these questions and pursue them very robustly in a project that was framed within early America. Previously, I wasn't focusing in particular on enslaved people specifically. It was kind of more broadly African Americans. And so I really began thinking about enslaved people's relationship to the environment. And the more I dug and the more I read work from a range of scholars, it became clear that in slavery studies writ large, in the broader historiography, the environment is always there. It's always present. Scholars are always writing and thinking about the environment, but it wasn't always foregrounded, right? You can't really talk about the history of enslavement in the Americas, in the United States, without in some way, shape, or form speaking to the broader landscape of slavery, whether that's on plantations, whether that's in urban locales, whether that's at industrial sites such as ironworks. And so from there, from reading in a different way, looking for different things, the entire project really came into frame.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for invoking our dear colleague, the late Ira Berlin, whose work undergirds, I think, so much of what we do at Hard Histories, and certainly has had such a strong influence on my own work. I appreciate that, and we'll be sure we keep a bibliography on our website, and Dr. Berlin's works are included there. So thank you for that. Dr. Williams, can I ask you the same question? And I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. When I first started graduate school, I'd taken 3 years off, but before that, as an undergraduate at UVA, which of course is founded by Thomas Jefferson, I think I was very well versed in the extent to which we are familiar with the founding fathers as a cast of characters. And by the time I got to graduate school, I was very eager to pursue historical subjects who are not so prominent. And I had a meeting with Michael Johnson. Well, I should also mention, I had read Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemmings of Monticello relatively recently, and I was just blown away by the extent to which she allows her readers to really come to know her historical subjects, who are, of course, notoriously difficult to know due to the limitations of the archive about as it relates to enslaved people. So I knew broadly that I wanted to focus on enslaved Americans in a sort of, as much as I could, replicate the way that we learn about prominent white founding fathers to that minute detail, if that makes sense. And Mike Johnson, who is now emeritus, and I think was already emeritus at Hopkins, introduced me to this body of records, the Manifest of Enslaved People, which of course I ended up building the database on, which lists thousands and thousands of names. And I was blown away by this because I think there is, I hesitate to call it a fiction because it's partly true, but there's an understanding that enslaved people are not knowable in the archive. And in many ways that is true. However, I was struck by these records and that what they did contains, most obviously the identities of thousands of captives of the domestic slave trade, and also the relative inaccessibility of these records to communities of descendants and to scholars alike. I have a somewhat obsessive personality, I've learned over the years. So of course I took to this project pretty quickly and decided to build a database initially of just enslaved people sent to New Orleans from Baltimore. And then for my dissertation and subsequent work, I've expanded to the entire coastwise traffic. That's.
Yeah. I do think an obsessive personality is in order in this work. And one of the things that I like to say to our students in the Hard History Lab is, you know, you're onto something when 3 hours have passed, or you find yourself at 2 a.m. and you're still working through those materials. And I think a lot of us in this work have had that experience. It's not a prerequisite, but it helps, I think.
14 hours a day my entire first year of grad school. I still have back problems from that. But.
So it's one thing to sort of have a question, but it's another to figure out how to answer it. And Dr. Williams, you've already alluded to the ways in which we know there are silences, there are gaps, right? There are fissures in the archive that we wrestle with. But I want to ask you more to talk about your sources in both cases, because they're very rich, but they're hardly transparent. And the students in the Hard History Lab, some of whom are tuned in today, have been working to read sources like census returns and manumission papers, and are just discovering how to work with those things in innovative ways, ways that make them speak in a sense. And so I want to ask you more, if I could, Dr. Williams, about those ship manifests. If you could tell us a little bit more about what they are, but more, I think, what it takes to explain them or to use them to explain the dynamics of the domestic slave trade, particularly from the perspective of enslaved people. What else do you need in order to tell that story?
Sure, that's a big question. Well, to start with what they are. So they were drafted, their intention behind them in being required was not to document the domestic slave trade, but to enforce the transatlantic slave trade abolition. So as part of the same act that outlawed the transatlantic traffic in 1808, domestic captains were required to file a manifest listing the names of enslaved people on them they had on board, and to sign an affidavit swearing that they were not, in their language, imported from Africa. So they are modeled after cargo manifests, and they list names from the Upper South, mostly first and last names, heights, ages, sex, and a phenotypical racial description, usually Black, brown, that kind of subjective assessment, the ship information and all of that, and the dates. So let's see, I think the most important thing I have learned about how to use these records is to always keep in mind who was drafting them and what role enslaved people had in their drafting. So for example, for a long time, I puzzled over the fact that a majority of enslaved people from Virginia and Maryland are listed by first and last name on manifests. But if you look at runaway ads, fugitive ads in newspapers, most of the time, enslaved people are not given first and last names. And in addition, they are often described as, say, Jimmy instead of James. Whereas on manifest, I would see James more often, and I statistically analyzed all of this. And that is an insight, I think, into the fact that enslaved people, when these manifests were drafted, were asked, what is your name? And so to them, asserting a first and last name assertion of identity is a way that they exercise whatever control they could over preserving that identity in the traffic. But if you don't consider, well, who's writing this and how did that process unfold, you might miss things like that. It's also been important to, as so many scholars, most notably to me, Jessica Johnson, have emphasized, to keep in mind what spaces these records leave unfilled. So Dr. Johnson refers to this as the null value, which to me, I take almost literally, and I have a column in my spreadsheet for information about an enslaved person's family. which in most cases I can't get from a manifest. From time to time I can, but it's important to bracket space for that as something that's left unanswered by this kind of record. And I think the last priority I have with these records is to remember that they were drafted in a moment of rupture and trauma. And so when you use them to narrate enslaved lives, you are necessarily narrating a moment of rupture and trauma, which is important to do, but it's also not the entirety of that enslaved person's life. And so to me, this really speaks to the importance of unsiloing digital archives. And what I mean by that is, historians have long been in the practice of finding a record about a person or an enslaved person and hunting down another record. And when you do that person by person, it will take years, and it's an admirable endeavor, but it will take years to find, maybe the narratives of 5 people's lives, right? But more and more, we are building these huge data sets that have different moments of enslaved people's lives. And the more that we can unsilo those data sets, the more we will be able to narrate enslaved people's lives as lives instead of as snapshots and just moments, which are, again, not coincidentally, mostly moments of trauma and when enslaved people had limited agency. So I spend a lot of time, perhaps most of my time, trying to link different sources to get a better understanding of enslaved people's lives as they unfolded. So for example, Freedmen's Bureau records, a lot of the time when enslaved people deposited money in the Freedmen's, I know many of you will know this, but in the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, they filled out these little index cards, which were formulaic, but people wrote in information that they thought they wanted to write in. So even I last saw my sister here. And those are so valuable because they're in the enslaved person's voice and their perspective, and linking that to a manifest, for instance, gives you a fuller picture. One last example is there's I've been working on lately, William Still, who was an abolitionist active on the Underground Railroad, frequently interviewed enslaved people when they arrived at his home about their experience. And I have been linking those interviews with another data set I've built of fugitive advertisements. So fugitive advertisements are, of course, authored by white people seeking to reclaim their enslaved property. And so they give very different explanations of why an enslaved person ran away than that same person does when he or she is interviewed by William Still. And I think that kind of work is so important given the inherent biases and power dynamics of records like manifest or fugitive ads, or most of the things that we work with scholars of slavery.
Your insights really resonate with the previous 2 conversations we've had in this series, one with Dr. Jessica Millward and the other with Dr. Will Thomas, both of whom very much turn in their book-length works to collective biography in the end, I think, responding to the kind of ethical kind of impulse that you're describing. And so it helped, your comments really help us think about sort of the stakes in that turn and how we're able to actually make that turn, it turns out, in ways that I think we couldn't perhaps a generation or 2 ago. Dr. Perry, let me ask you about your archives, because I want to especially ask you about what I'm going to term slave narratives. And this is a material that we are very much at work on. Jillian Thomas in the Hard Histories Lab has been reading slave narratives, and your article has been so important for us in thinking about how to use them critically. Some of those are produced in the 19th century, and then others of them produced decades and decades later in the 20th century. And I know this is, you are sort of the inheritor of a long debate about how to use those materials, but we wind up going back to them again and again. And so could you say something about those materials and how you come to work with them and on them in a way that is a new chapter, I guess, in thinking about how to work with these very old sources?
Sure, sure. I in the article itself that appears in Slavery and Abolition, as well as in the book project, I definitely and in many ways unapologetically utilize and rely on different kinds of slave narratives in conjunction with a range of other sources, from archaeological, the archaeological record, to more traditional slaveholder account books, diaries, newspapers, what have you. So I largely view slave narratives as part of a broader constellation of sorts of source material, but then as their own type or genre of evidence, or as their own evidentiary base. I think slave narratives play a really critical role, especially as it relates to retrieving different portions of enslaved people's everyday lives. I think it becomes really easy when we turn to those records, or really any other kind of records, to at times gloss over the mundane, as is often the case in our own kind of daily lives, particularly the mundane as it expresses itself in relation to the environment, and the extent to which the environment and the worlds in which we inhabit, the extent to which they pervade our daily lives. And so for me, when I look at slave narratives and when I read them in a particular kind of way, and when I read a slaveholder's diary in a particular kind of way, or a newspaper account in a particular kind of way, the environment and people's relationship to the environment is almost always on full display. And so I'm especially interested, as it relates to slave narratives in particular, in matters of the mundane, in the everyday, as it asserts itself for the enslaved, and different modes of engaging and interacting with and encountering the weather, for example, or their kind of immediate surroundings, water and the aquatic environment, the land and the landscape. How does the land and the landscape play into a particular moment or scene? So for me, questions or matters of procuring food, right? Just foodways, enslaved people's foodways, as a really important part of the everyday that shows up in a lot of slave narratives across the board, so much so that we can begin to compare and to think broadly about foodways as it relates to procuring food, whether that's growing one's own food, whether that's hunting, whether that's foraging, ways of preparing food, ways of consuming and distributing and trading food and food items, to think about using these kind of examples to think about how it is enslaved peoples are interacting with the world around them, how it is they in different ways come to rely on their environmental worlds to sustain their lives, to enrich their lives, to sustain and enrich the lives of loved ones. We see in enslaved people's lives, looking through matters of food, looking in different ways in which enslaved women and men move in the world, we see the extent to which their very lives relied heavily on a foundational and at many turns, a distinctive relationship to their environs, one that diverged in large part from that of slaveholders, which I get at a bit in the project, being that the enslaved, as it relates to being human beings who are also chattels, have a very different set of circumstances that bring them into relation with the world they inhabit.
I can't help but think that there's an interesting connection between your work in thinking about the environment, the landscape, the Chesapeake, water, the port. All of those things are so consequential in both of your studies, even as you're asking very different questions, but you're really bringing it into focus for me. I want to turn to questions from the audience. And I'll preface that by saying that today and tomorrow, I, along with lots of us, am participating in the meeting of the university's Studying Slavery Consortium, which is being hosted by Georgetown University. And one of the talks this morning was from Mr. Joe Stewart, who is a descendant of those who were held enslaved by the Jesuit order in early America, or colonial America. He's now one of the leaders of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. So I thought I would pick up on a question in the Q&A about the ways in which you all understand or hope your work helps us understand to a gentle degree the present. In your case, Dr. Perry, I think you helped me think differently about the landscape, about the land, about its preservation and more. And I wonder about the ways in which we should think about, I'm thinking about the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park and the way they've set aside acreage, right, as an artifact of Tubman's life. And then for you, Dr. Williams, in a very different way, but I think equally important, some of us have read your 2018 op-ed for the Baltimore Sun, where you not only called for the university to atone for its connections to the slave trade, but you call for a kind of process that I'll use the word justice, rather than, for example, taking down names and statues. You really urge a kind of process. And so maybe that's a place to begin. I'll start with you, Dr. Perry, just to ask you, can you help us see the connections? I don't want to be too didactic, but I do think there are strong connections between the past that you bring to us and how we might think about, what environmental justice, for example, looks like in the 21st century.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a question that I continue to think about. I continue to meditate on, especially as matters of justice and environmental racism are becoming increasingly acute and urgent and increasingly a part of public conversations and questions about policy. And so I think there are well, a couple of things come immediately to mind, and I'll try to be brief, but it's certainly a much broader conversation. One, it's very easy, I think, for us as individuals to think about the places in which we live, through our own kind of interactions and encounters with them. I think one of the things that I've appreciated from reading a range of scholarly sources and engaging in different kinds of work from visual art to music to other forms is thinking about the ways in which the past has absolutely, and people of the past in particular, enslaved people, have left their mark on the world in which we inhabit. The very landscape of Maryland, the very landscape of the United States, this part of our world that we interact with physically, directly, every day, bears the mark of the history of slavery, bears the mark of enslaved people's labor. Like, we can think about this labor in terms of economics and the kind of economic foundation of the United States, but we can also think about the very shape and layout and materiality of the physical world that we live and inhabit on a daily basis. So that's something that, in thinking about the trace and the very present trace, the very material trace of enslaved people's lives, is something that that certainly comes to mind. I would also say there are ways in which there are ways in which we can, in thinking about the environment historically and contemporarily, there are ways in which there might be opportunities to tap into really or distinctly human elements of enslaved people's lives and thinking about the world as we encounter it today. For example, we all pretty much know something, at least something of what it's like to be cold, right? To be cold, to be human beings that are seeking warmth in a moment, or seeking to warm perhaps a child or a loved one, or perhaps empathizing with someone we know who is cold in a moment. Although in a very different set of circumstances, right? We can use that to begin to perhaps extrapolate, triangulate, whatever kind of word we would want to use, what it may have been like for enslaved peoples to contend with cold weather on a daily basis. And thinking about winters in Maryland, in the Upper South, thinking about winters really throughout the South. Especially when we take into account the kind of context of slavery, where enslaved peoples are oftentimes in quarters that are poorly insulated, oftentimes have to supplement lacking food provisions by going out into their immediate environs to procure food. When we think about clothing, that's often inadequate in enslaved people's daily lives, and the ways and in this way, kind of take what might be elements of present life, of our daily, everyday, mundane lives, as an entry point into thinking about the past, but then also as a way of encountering and interacting with past lived experiences today, and the ways in which they can help us better understand our orientation in the world before us today. So when it comes to matters of justice, environmental racism, how we move in the world today, how Black people, how white people, how different peoples in the US move today in the very world, we would do well to begin to contextualize that around matters of movement and space and landscape in the in historical framings of slavery.
Thank you for that. And I think it connects to the discussion of the slave narratives, because I think you use the narratives with great effect, to Dr. Williams's point about humanity, in a way that is very specific, but is also, I think, really transcends and helps us think about the human experience. So thank you for that. Dr. Williams, I know your piece is a few years back now, but we'd be happy to hear kind of how you're thinking about these questions has evolved. And you need to unmute, sorry.
I'm bad about that. Okay. I think both when I wrote that piece and still my thinking about uncovering, so just to, in case anybody's not familiar with that story, the Baltimore traffic to New Orleans was about 70% of it was run by just four slave traders, one of whom was named, so each sent about 3,000 enslaved people to the slave markets of New Orleans. One of those men was Joseph Donovan, and his wife, Caroline Donovan, who of course inherited his fortune, and it was a sizable fortune, endowed the first chair at Johns Hopkins University. And so, and in covering that story, and every time I hear about similar stories, I'm of two minds, which are, first, that it's good these things are coming to light. The second is that why is anybody surprised? I think that really, if we were doing this sort of history in the most efficient way, it would be to find the aspects of our collective history that aren't linked to the slave trade and to the forced labor of enslaved people, which is, it sounds cynical, but I think, you know, the more you're in this, it's very rare to come across something that dates to the 19th century that doesn't have links to slavery and the slave trade. So in terms of how it could inform where we go from here, I think a lot about what it takes for Americans to be willing to consider measures that address this history. So for an example, I did some research with high school students at Gonzaga University on enslaved people who helped build that school and worked there. And after spending 2 weeks in the archive with these kids, and I think they're teachers on this call, which is exciting. I asked them at lunch, I said, and one of the enslaved boys who worked at the school was a 13 or 14-year-old kid named Gabriel. And I said to the students, if we could find Gabriel's descendants who are probably in Louisiana or thereabouts, if they have stayed there, if that family has stayed there since Gabriel was sent there, what would you do? What would you want to do? And these teenagers all said, well, they should get admission to Gonzaga and, retributive justice and reparations. And they were all on board. And I said, okay, but at the time of the Civil War, there were 4 million Gabriels, right? But then of course, and I don't mean to pick on these kids, but that was a sort of a bridge too far. And I think a lot about how much of this work do we have to do until Americans realize this isn't an isolated story of this isn't a Johns Hopkins story. It's not a Gonzaga story. It's not any particular isolated case, but this is really most of our institutions, most of our history. And I don't mean to sound too frustrated, but sometimes I am frustrated that we have to go about this in a piecemeal fashion. We should not be surprised. And really, I think it would be a better use of our time to just go about addressing what we know are the legacies rather than finding, it's important to find examples and uncover histories, but it's also it's going to be an endless task.
Well, you make me think about the contrast, say, between the US and France, right? Where France, slavery has been formally recognized by the national government as having been a crime against humanity. There is a national foundation that is responsible, right, sort of for the nation as a whole to do the kind of work that I hear you sort of lamenting we do kind of piecemeal and idiosyncratically. And yet I do think that part of what I was hearing in the conversations about Georgetown is there's something about scale in that work, right? That some of that work is sort of of a national scale. The memory, commemoration, kind of foundation, and even funding. And then on the other hand, there are these sort of intimate scenes of atonement, as in the Georgetown case, reconciliation, reckoning, and more. And so I'm interested in the way we work at very different and essentially different kinds of scales as we do the work. But that's incredibly helpful. Let me ask a question that really makes me smile as a historian of Baltimore and Maryland. And it comes from Ivanka Anand, who indicates that they are an incoming Johns Hopkins history PhD student. And the question is this: thank you for your talks and your work. People today like to debate, sometimes in jest, whether Maryland is a part of the South. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the extent to which a Southern identity was or was not part of Maryland's antebellum history, and how that association with Southern values and narratives may have changed over time as slavery was abolished. Is Maryland the South? I get that a lot, or I get the Maryland is not the South a lot. So I wonder how you all kind of think about your work as helping us to answer that question. Dr. Perry, can I ask you first?
Sure. It's a question that brings up different things, but one of them being the distinction between North and South, and then particularly the portion of the South that seceded from the United States, and the kind of delineation we tend to make there when we identify parts of the US as the North, right? And different narratives as it relates to, or perceptions of the history of that part of the country versus the South in relation to slavery. And so the delineation I get and I understand, and I think it makes sense. I'll say off the bat, yes, I certainly believe Maryland is a part of the South, very technically and then also culturally. But I think more than that, in thinking about Maryland as a slave state, and a slave state in which the history and the roots of slavery run deep, right? They run deeply in the state. Slavery, I believe, is codified in Maryland in 1664, and slavery in Maryland, although not long after, but as an institution that bears as heavily as slavery does, slavery in Maryland exists after, right? The Emancipation Proclamation. And so to think about Maryland as a slave state that sits at the center of a broader set of slave states that extends from well into the north, to the deepest parts of the South, I think that becomes, I think the designation of a slave state becomes a really useful mode of creating tension with and complicating larger matters and conversations around North and South, and some of the kind of cultural differences, because we know economically, we know culturally, the institution of slavery pervaded all parts of the United States and American and early American culture. And so Maryland is in many ways at the center of at the center of a lot of what is happening as this institution over time pervaded the very foundation and fabric of this country.
So South is kind of a misleading kind of frame, because really for you the germane question is about slaveholding places, in Maryland is certainly one of those. Thanks for that. Dr. Williams, is Maryland the South? You know, I'll just tell you that, you know, on this, I'm a student of Dr. Julius Scott, who says, you know, Baltimore was the northernmost port of the Caribbean. It's a Caribbean place, not a Southern place, but that's a conversation for a different day or a different kind of question. But how do you think about Maryland as the South?
In a short answer, yes, I think of Maryland as part of the South. I think it depends on the context of this question, right? So if people are asking about relatively benign cultural things, like whether you can order sweet tea in Baltimore, I don't know, I don't really care. But yeah, to echo what Dr. Perry said, if Maryland's economy and entire way of life historically is linked to slavery and the slave trade, then yes. And to me, that's obviously a much more meaningful distinction. I think it's also important to think about the ways that sort of the locus of slavery in America shifted through multiple Souths throughout time, right? So in the 18th century, of course, Maryland is the heart of slavery in North America, Maryland and Virginia. Not that, so I think actually I don't need to add much to what Dr. Perry said. I agree with pretty much everything. I don't need to restate it.
Okay, I think that, you know, there is, though, I think for our work at Hard Histories, this is a question that sort of runs underneath what we do, the varying ways in which we can think about this question, right? Maryland as a slaveholding place, but also Maryland is not part of the Confederacy, and more. And then there's Barbara Fields's notion of Maryland as the middle ground, right? Someplace not quite north, not quite south. Baltimore in particular, right, as sort of shape, you know, closer to Philadelphia than to Richmond during the Civil War. And I think those kinds of framings are consequential for how we read the history of key figures in Maryland, like Johns Hopkins, right? And the possibilities for somebody like Hopkins are particular and if not peculiar if not unique, right? To the fact that Baltimore is where he lives and works. So I guess I have about 3 minutes before I have to turn things back over to Kendra. So maybe I could just wrap up by asking you both to just say a little bit about what you're working on and where the work is going and what we can look forward to. Because we thank you for this conversation and we're eager to know what's coming next. Dr. Williams?
I'm not muted. Okay. So I am working with the team at slavevoyages.org on getting the database that I've built of the domestic coastwise traffic up and accessible. We're hoping to have that done by the end of the year. I said that out loud now, so it better happen. I'm also working on revising my dissertation into a book manuscript. That's about it. That's plenty, actually.
Okay, well, it is plenty to keep you busy. You want to say something about the scope of the book?
Sure. So the book is like my dissertation on the coastwise traffic to New Orleans. So it will begin with describing the homes enslaved people were forced to leave behind in the coastwise traffic. So for about 70%, that would be Virginia and Maryland. It will also have a chapter on the jails enslaved people were kept in before their departure, slave traders' private jails. It will describe the voyage experience and then the enslaved people's experience in New Orleans and beyond.
Terrific. Well, thank you. You know, we look forward to that. We look forward to having you back to talk more about it. So thank you. And Dr. Perry?
Yeah, so my book project is broadly thinking about enslaved people's relationship to the environment. And I've expanded it from Maryland to really the Chesapeake Bay watershed and really thinking regionally and thinking in ways that, again, kind of stand in tension with a north-south designation. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed extends from just below Richmond all the way through central Pennsylvania to southern New York. But the kind of focus is on Maryland as kind of at the heart of this like Chesapeake region. And so over the course of a few chapters, I focus on enslaved people's relationship to the land and landscape, to the supernatural environment as an environment that in many enslaved people's lives was just as important as the physical. Their relationship to the weather and climate, as well as to what I'm framing as the immediate environment, the environment that consisted of simply what was nearby in space and time. And really over the course of the project, I attend specifically to the ways in which enslaved women and men leveraged their relationship to different parts of the environment for daily, everyday needs, but then also in times of desperation or in moments of acute emergency, and really think about how the mundane, how they can draw on the knowledge, the environmental knowledge and experience that accrues from labor, from their daily lives as laborers to their lives outside of the arena of labor, to mobilize this knowledge and experience however they so chose.
Terrific. And please come back and share with us more. We had at Hopkins not so long ago, historian J.T. Rohn, who's also at work on the Chesapeake region and the environment in a later period. So I see this work coming together really powerfully. So I'm going to thank you both. And it is my pleasure to return the microphone back to Kendra Grissom, and who will take us out. Thanks so much again, Kendra, for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you very much to Dr. Tony Perry and Dr. Jenny Williams for this incredibly rich conversation. We're honored to have had you here and appreciate how your research sheds light on the questions we are asking at the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project. I personally found that there were so many takeaways from today's discussion, from methodology to archival practice to contemplating the ways that our world today is shaped by history and how scholarship is relevant in shaping social justice efforts. Personally, as a native Marylander whose family has been in the state since the early 1800s, and a member of a community group dedicated to preserving and teaching state and local history in Howard County, Maryland, I am thrilled to have been introduced to the works of Dr. Perry and Dr. Williams and look forward to sharing them with my own networks. Thank you to our audience for watching and for sending in your great questions, and to the team at the SNF Agora Institute for their support for this event. During these book conversations, we have the chance to share what we're reading. We're also interested in what you're reading. What sources have helped you to better understand the hard questions we are asking at the Hard Histories Project? Share them with us and help build our collective Hard Histories bibliography. Let other members of the Hopkins and Baltimore community know about those books and articles that are helping you sort through the history of enslavement and more. You can reach us on social media with the hashtag JHU Hard Histories or at our email address, hardhistories@jhu.edu. We look forward to hearing from you and learning from you too. Finally, please plan to join us on Wednesday, April 28th from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern for our next Hard Histories event featuring Dr. Lawrence Jackson. This event will center Dr. Jackson's work on Frederick Douglass in Baltimore, as well as issues of race and racism in the city more generally that Johns Hopkins University must face. You can learn more about Hard Histories at Hopkins at hardhistory.jhu.edu. Additional information about our event series is posted at snfagora.jhu/event. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.